Calvin Castine at the Champlain Meeting House. It's the 10th of November, 2022. And we're here, as we often are, to hear an author. I'm going to call you a local author, although I don't know where you're from.
Plattsburgh.
Where?
Plattsburgh.
Plattsburgh. I've heard of Plattsburgh.
Yeah, and I worked up here.
Did you?
So I was a teacher at Northeastern.
Okay. And, your name?
Daniel Ladue.
Daniel Ladue. We have some Ladues right here in Champlain. You know.
We're not related.
They may spell it different, but
No, we're not
pronounce
related.
it the same. Well, maybe if you went far enough back. You know?
Yeah.
Okay, so what did you teach here at Northeastern?
For the first half of my career, I taught English, and so many older adults know me as an English teacher, and then mid-career, I became a school librarian, and I worked in Moores for 10 years, and then I came back to the high school prior to retirement. So.
Okay, so when was retirement? How many years ago?
16 years ago. 06, yeah.
You must be an old fellow then.
Pretty much.
Is this your first
This is my first, yeah.
first of
But
many?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right, Bold and Courageous, is that the title, or is there a subtitle?
That is the subtitle, 25 North Country Women and Their Exceptional Contributions.
All right, so how'd you get the idea for this?
I started working on a book about people in general, and I was kind of spinning my wheels, and then I realized the greater story was with women. There's some extraordinary women who came out of Clinton County. The most significant female theologian of the mid-20th century in the world is from here, not Champlain.
No.
The very first female dentist in the world to get a doctorate of dentistry is from here.
Ellenberg.
Ellenberg, Clinton County. Franklin County claims her too because she was born in Ellenberg and then crossed the border to grow up.
Ellenberg Center has the Ellenberg Center has the historical
Yes,
marker.
they do, yeah.
So how far back do we go, and how recent?
The first one is Lucretia Davidson. They were born in about 1805, and she and her sister became very, very famous early 19th century romantic poets. They were anthologized in the country, they were anthologized in Europe, and they were taught well into the 20th century. They are still being written about at the deepest scholarly levels, you know, with the academic levels, with people who are writing about that stuff. Their poetry has gone out of favor. No, and then the last woman is a woman by the name of Thelma Douglas. Thelma was, she's basically the founder of Beartown. And so Thelma died in 2015.
Okay.
So you have to be dead to be in this book. You don't want to be.
And female and dead. Two criteria. Okay. So are you going to be talking about the theologian?
I am going to be talking, no.
Oh, so mention her
I'm
name.
actually only talking about up here, the northern tier of
Who's the
Clinton.
theologian then?
Georgia Harkness, Dr. Georgia Harkness, who comes from Harkness.
Harkness, yeah.
And she got a PhD under the same advisor who advised Martin Luther King. And she went on to the world stage. She is the woman who is responsible for women being ordained in the Methodist tradition.
Oh, okay.
1956.
All right, looks like Janet is ready to go.
Okay.
I'm looking around here, and all I see is females. I may have told to leave. I don't know.
Well, it is a book about women.
All right, I'll let Janet introduce you.
Thank you all for coming. This is part of our author visit at the Champlain Meeting House. So happy that Dan agreed to come talk about his new book. Just a minute, there's one coming. Wait a sec. Hey, hi there. Okay, so this is Dan LaDue. He was at Northeastern Clinton for many years. He was the school librarian and I think became a Spanish teacher at some point, somewhere. After he retired. He lives in Plattsburgh 6 months of the year. He goes to Mexico City during the winter, and he saves a couple months for traveling. Just came back from a really awesome trip that I witnessed and lived through vicariously on Facebook. Amazing photos. That should be another presentation at some point. Just leave that in the back of your mind. He's written a fascinating book, Bold and Courageous, 25 North Country New York Women and Their Exceptional Contributions. And that is what he's going to talk about tonight. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm
going to
I
monitor
need, yeah, I'm gonna get another, there's a chair here. And I'm going to go get another.
Alice.
Hi, Dan. Just tell Mary when you need it move forward.
Okay, thank you, Mary, for doing this. I appreciate it. Yeah, I taught at Northeastern. I started in 1972, I think, in Wars, when Wars finally merged with, and I lived through all that hotbed of emotion about Wars shouldn't be affiliated with Champlain and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but I was an English teacher for the first half of my career, and then I went back to get an MLS, and so I worked for Moores for 10 years, and then I came back here for 6 years before I retired. So anyway, I had a very rich retirement. And this is the first book that I have. I have 2 manuscripts of it. One's done, it's with the publisher, and another one will be finished this winter. So I'd like to introduce you to a group of women. Lucy Hobbs Taylor, some of you might know her. She was the very first female in the world to get her doctorate of dentistry. And she was born in Ellenburg, and she then moved to Franklin County, so both counties claim her. Frances DeLord Webb Hall was from the Kent DeLord House, but we're going to hear her in a very different context tonight. And then Eula Otis and Claire Bourne and Veronica Jetty. Do any of those names ring a bell to anybody? Well, Eula brought the Michigan to Plattsburgh. Oh, I know, that always is a good response.
Okay.
And then Minnie Mayo and Abigail Kluge, and if you can help me, Andy, with Minnie Mayo, I would really appreciate it. These women, their families don't know that they're in this book, because I don't even know who their families are. So let's go to the first slide. Lucy was born in Ellenburg in 1833. If you go to the Ellenburg Depot, I think, if you go to where the church is, there's a historical marker. It wasn't very many years when she moved across county lines. When she came from a family that valued education. And, look at when she was born, 1833. There were not many opportunities for women at that point. You either became a nurse, you got married, or you became a teacher. And it was a teacher not like we have been educated as teachers. Lucy went to school at the Franklin Academy. It was a very aggressive academic program. It's a program that is pretty much useless for what we think of today. I mean, it taught you Greek and Latin and astronomy and accounting, but it qualified her to be a teacher. So she moved out to Michigan, and she got a job. That was the frontier at that point. And she got a job in a small school, and she boarded with a doctor. And she became very interested in what the doctor was doing, and the doctor was teaching her. And she said, I want to go to medical school. And he says, well, and so he said, I think you might want to consider dentistry, because back then dentistry was, there was no training. It was basically the barber who did the training. And so she started to do that. And she actually built a practice, and people liked her work. You want to go to the next slide? That's not Lucy. There are very few pictures of Lucy. They liked the fact that Lucy was working on them. Her hands were small. And she was obviously very clever with her hands. She actually invented things, and she built up this practice of mostly women and children, but men also. And but she wanted to get a degree. And so she tried to get into a dental college. Well, of course, you can imagine, she's a woman, it's not going to happen. And she tries, and she tries, and she finally gets onto the Iowa State Dental Association. And she's the only woman in there, of course, and some of these men had gotten, dentistry degree, nothing like what we would think of today. And while you like to think that men aren't necessary, many of these women had to rely on men to help them. They had very, very supportive men. She had a very supportive father who educated her. She had a very supportive man in her life in the dental field. And so finally, the University of Ohio, the men said, you have to accept this woman. And they finally gave her a slot. And she just sailed right through the courses because she already knew the work. And in 1867, She is 67. I mean, women were not graduating from college in 1867. She gets her Doctor of Dentistry degree, thus being the very first woman in the United States, and unless somebody can prove me wrong, in the world. And she is a local girl. So, 2 years ago, in the COVID year, we lived in Mexico City, and it just was not safe to come home through New York. And we lost our tickets in Montreal because of the border. So we flew to the border city of near El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and drove home, which was a nice drive because nobody was on the road. And so I said, we have very good friends in Kansas, and I said, if we go through Kansas, we're going to go to Lawrence, because that's where she ended up settling. And this is her home, and it's now a hair salon. So I walked in, I walked around, but there's a commemorative plaque on it. And then the next slide, we went, oh, that's Marcia Brown, I'm sorry. Right, that's another moment. We went to her grave and cleaned it up, and oh, I meant to tell you that she got married through this, a guy named James Taylor, easy name to remember, and he was a Civil War veteran, and she trained him. And so they practiced in this building, and he took the men. He did not have a dental degree, and she took the women and children. And so she is very well known, and she is not in the Women's Hall of Fame, and I'm going to try to correct that, because she really should be. Okay. Marcia's a fascinating story, but we're not doing that tonight. Frances Hall, she went with the name Fanny. Oh, I'm going to ask you, if you have any questions about Lucy, ask them now. And so that I'll stop at the end of each woman.
Did she have any children?
No, they did not have children. That was another thing. If you had children, it would impede on your life.
Right.
If you married, it would impede on your life. So she was single. Well, through all of this, it was only well after the Civil War that she met James Taylor. You know.
What level of dentistry did they do? Did they have anesthetic? Did they do fillings, or were they just pulling teeth?
Well, they would have done all of that, but I didn't delve a whole lot into that. I do believe the book touches on that. I mean, it would be certainly more primitive dentistry than we have today, but probably a whole lot better than your barber doing it. So I would assume there would have been some form of sedative. But mind you, she was practicing from 1867. She died in, I think, 1910. And she wasn't practicing much at that point. So that's more than 100 years ago.
I'd just like to add that that plaque at the Methodist Church in Ellenburg was put there because of Addie Shields, our former county historian.
Addie was wonderful.
There was a big celebration that day that should be right up somewhere.
She says to me, "What's your last name?" And I said, "LaDue." She goes, "You look just like Clarence." So, with Clarence LaDue.
And just for clarification, it's in Ellenburg Center, just past the fire station.
It's Ellenburg Center.
Is it Ellenburg
Just past the
Center?
fire station,
All
up the hill.
halls are Ellenburg Center.
Up the hill.
So, any questions on that? So, Frances Fanny Hall, she's very, very well known for many, many things. Frances with an E and her husband Francis with an I were the closest thing to what you might call a power couple of the mid-19th century. He was a Presbyterian minister. They were well-heeled financially. She was a Delord Webb, so she was the last person who lived in the Kent Delord house. Her husband died in 1903 in October. She died exactly 10 years to the day later. Again, they did not have children, and I don't know why. So I suspect that if they had, she never could have accomplished what she did. Fanny was a social activist for the poor and for the marginalized and for people who were in prison. She was also a medical practitioner who did what she could do. I mean, she was never trained. But like most women of the, say, the mid-19th century onward, she was very involved with alcohol. we know about Prohibition, we know about the repeal of Prohibition, we'll talk a little bit about the rum runners up here, but it was a serious issue because there were no social networks, no social nets, you know, and it didn't primarily affect just men, of course it would affect women, but it just destroyed families because, and you know, in a family where the father was, you know, spending all of the money, there was no welfare to get to pay. People had to farm out their children to other people. So in December of 1873, and it's in Fredonia, which is where I went to college, this group of people, there had been a clamor from the beginning of the 1800s to stop demon rum because it really was doing a lot of damage. And so a group of people at a church organized, and on December 15th, they create the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. She was very, very involved in that. She, as many of the women, starting from Hall onwards in the book, were involved with WCTU. If you were a middle-class white Protestant woman of the late 19th century, you were a member of the WCTU. I mean, it was a good organization, however, politically correct, no, from today's point of view. Just jump to another slide. They actually were able, by 1920, and they actually were able to create the 18th Amendment that prohibited the sale of alcohol. And that is 1 year before women were allowed to vote. So this is significant. I mean, this was a male vote that did this. And of course, you can imagine. I have my slides mixed up here, but I love that slide. I found it online. You know, Ham's beer, hottest hot box. So I mean, that was these women. They would stand in front of bars in Plattsburgh, and they would, today you would probably get slammed for that, but they would just, you know, drag these men out, they would ridicule them, and they ultimately got what they wanted. So while I have a slide in here that the WCTU, there was a big KKK link to the WCTU. Of course, I mean, I don't think that the KKK was viewed the same way it is today. I mean, it was a pretty bad organization at any time, but there were photos of women with the hats. They also mobilized, and they would go to Ellis Island, and they would nab that Italian who drank the wine right from the beginning, and there would be this education. I mean, they were allowed to educate these people with American values, which meant no drinking. I don't know what success they had. Today, you would be able to do something like that. So the story about Fall is actually very applicable to here because, some of you are nodding your head, all of you know stories of the rum runners. I cannot talk about that. That is in my next book on the men, but there were, the stories are legion of people attempting to carry alcohol across the border. Many of whom succeeded, many of whom didn't, as you can see. And so they slid through any possible place that they could along this. Then it was a much more open border than it is today. Today, I don't think you could do that. I think there's some type of signals that just give off the moment you cross the border. I mean, you might not see anything, but I can almost guarantee that. There was one time about 15 years ago, a group of us were right on the border on our bicycles, and we're in Canada, we're in the United States, and we crossed and had lunch on a pond in Canada. I think today, this was pre-9/11, I really think the helicopter over is real fast right now. So finally, they succeeded until 1933. And you know, perhaps some of you have stories of people who were involved with rum running, but it's a long time ago, you know. And in a sense, they failed, but I'm not sure they failed. They may have, and I don't know what Prohibition actually accomplished. I mean, in a sense, it then made alcohol taboo, which means I'm going to do it. You know, much like we know cigarettes are pretty horrible, so why are you 18 and smoking a cigarette? You know, it's a taboo thing now. So they succeeded. Today, thank heavens, we have programs that exist, and I think Mrs. Hall would be very, very pleased with Alcoholics Anonymous, with programs that are help for intervention and places where you can go for a month to dry out. She would be very pleased with that. But again, Fanny Hall is way more than just WCTU. Okay. So, does anybody not like Michigans? So I was gone for 6 weeks, and this is my next book. My editor said, if you get the book into me by the middle of September, I can guarantee it for June. And so Michael Cashman and I, who was the town supervisor for Plattsburgh, because all of the primary Michigan places are in the town. And we're going to have a proper book launching with that one because July is National Hot Dog Month, but around here it's Michigan Month, you know. So, and Michael Cashman, he's not from here, he's from Cape Cod, but he loves his Michigan, as do most people. So I'm going to bring you through a little bit. Okay, there's a whole lot more to this story. And you might think, how on earth did you write a book about the Michigan? But it's really interesting. Let's go on. So I want to introduce you to Eula Otis. Eula Otis was born in Arkansas, although she said she was from Tennessee. And she ends up in Michigan, where she meets a man by the name of, well, she is Eula Poff, okay? Eula Poff Roberts. So she marries this guy in 1917, and at some point, maybe they divorced, maybe they didn't, we don't know yet. And she meets a guy named Garth Otis, and Garth is from Hornet Rush. And like a lot of young people, they were in the Detroit area for car manufacturing. There was a lot of work there. And so, you know, do I know that he was working? We can't find any evidence, but it strongly suggests that he was probably in that field, and she probably came up. So they meet, and they get married. They come here, and they marry on Point of Rush. Of course, she marries as Eula Roberts, and that's her maiden name, but that was her married name. And now we think that Garth never knew that she was married the first time, so we're digging up on her. The publisher got hold of this. He says, I need to find more information about Eula Otis. So Eula, at some point, they're introduced to this hot dog with a meat sauce. Okay? Now, the next book will have a great deal of information. I can actually pinpoint the exact town in Europe where our Michigan sauce comes from. Every place in the country has meat sauce. But we're the only place that has Michigan sauce, and it is distinctly different. So Eula, they come here in 1927, and the myth says, hi, I'm from Michigan, try my Michigan, which is documented, but that's what people have said, she said, but there's no documentation she ever said that. They did advertise a hot dog dash Michigan style, which then, I'm going to ask you a question, is Michigan a proper noun or a common noun? It was a hot dog Michigan style. I posit that it is the proper noun, so, because of the Michigan style, if you look at the history of it. So they open up this little lunch stand at a theater that is no longer in Plattsburgh. It was burned, it burned. And within a short period of time, they rented space from a man by the name, I can't think of his name, Mr. Warren. Warren's lived out on the Lake Shore Road, where Claire and Carl's is, okay, because Carl is a Carl Warren. And it was his father that rented them this little shack. I mean, I've heard it was a shack, it was...
It still is.
No, we're not talking about...
Not
talking about this building. I mean, we're not talking about, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a building that looked like a shanty, people have told me. I mean, thank heavens for I call them my 90-year-olds, because they have wonderful stories to tell me. And she opens up this stand, and it becomes a hit. And within a very short period of time, other restaurants in Plattsburgh start serving the same thing, and they call it a Michigan. They could have called it anything else, but they call it a Michigan, which I find linguistically very interesting, because they could have said hot dog with a meat sauce. And so that is, there's no evidence that she ever said, hi, I'm from Michigan, try my Michigan. And I don't think Eula Otis would ever have known the success that the Michigans had. I mean, the Michigan is like denim, it's not going to go anywhere. Can you see 10 years from now, there's no more Michigans in Plattsburgh? So, Eula, do you know where Nitsy's used to be? Or,
Yes.
Yeah, that is where, I mean, if you take that building, which is they've expanded it, but that building was built in 1949 by Nitsy Raven. Okay, it's a little bit bigger now. If you put this dead center, that is where the shack used to be. So we have been able to pinpoint through deed records the exact location. And Claire Warren they were living, she's from, so if you know where I'm talking about, Claire and Carl's is here, and the old Nissy's is right here. And so you could actually see each other. And so Carl is this Mr. Warren's son, and he's living down in the White Plains area, and he's an engineer. And because they had 2 children, he was not called up into World War II. He was an engineer, but he was working in a car dealership. So I assumed that there were simply no more cars to sell, once by 1943. So they come back to Plattsburgh and move into the family home. Now, Mr. Warren, Carl Warren's father, had an agreement with Nitsy, because Nitsy got called up into the war, and the deal was, don't open up another Michigan stand for at least, if I don't come back within a year, then you can open up the Michigan. Well, Claire knew that. And so a year goes by, and she opens up Claire and Carl's, what she calls Claire and Carl's. So there's been a lot of speculation as to what that building was. Did they build that building? No, that building goes back to the 19th century, and we think that it was some kind of a storage unit, and that they jury-rigged, and it's so iconic that they better protect that thing. So Claire...
It lives on history.
Oh, it is. I mean,
It
it's,
is, but it's going to fall.
huh?
It's going to fall down.
Well, I hope not.
I don't want to.
But this is a photo, that is not Claire. I was able to interview a woman by the name of Terry Murray. Terry was married to Michael Murray, who was the grandson of Claire and Carl. And he died in 1990. He was quite young. He was only in his late 30s. So Terry did the business until about 4 or 5 years ago when she sold it to another relative. So at least it's still within the family. But that is not, I thought that was Claire and Carl, but that's the only known picture. There are no known pictures of Claire Warren. But Claire was really the business behind Claire and Carl's. Carl, I've heard wonderful stories about Carl. Carl was like, it was dinner and a show. And I remember my father, they were contemporaries, and that is the place that he wanted to go. I mean, people have their loyalties, and they're not going to violate their loyalties. And I could just see, sitting in the same place with my father inside, and Carl was always there. I was in my 30s, and he'd say, young man, he'd ask me a question, and he'd always give me $1. So he did that with kids, and he networked. I mean, people tell me that there were like 50 or 60 cars, and he would just do the rounds, and of course he knew everybody, and he'd say, oh, I'm so sorry, your dad died. And, he just networked, and he was a good networker. He also had an invisible dog named Bismarck, and he would so people have told me that as children, they were like, where's the dog, where's the dog? But everybody, and one of his favorite questions was, he goes, so, what do you like best, your mom or Santa Claus? Well, of course, the kid doesn't know what to say. She loves her mother and loves Santa Claus. And they're like, and then he'd always get $1, So, she was really the brains behind it. I've heard stories where, people say, oh, I have Claire and Carl's recipe. Oh, I have Ditsy's recipe. Don't believe that. they would never have shared their recipe. Claire guarded that recipe with her life. She mixed the spices at home and brought them in. Now, so to follow a line here, Eula Otis leaves Plattsburgh in 1936. There's a whole other story about her. And I'm assuming that she gave the recipe to Nitsi Reagan, because there's no evidence of it being sold. But of course it wasn't a cult food at that point. It was just, a food. And Nitsi sold it to another man who then sold it to what is now Michigan's Plus. So if you want to have the original, as close to possible recipe, you go to Michigan's Plus for that. And Michigan's Plus says, oh, there's too much liability to say that. And I said, there's no liability, you bought it. Eula had no children, there's no family involved. So the centennial of the mission comes up in 27, and Michigan's Plus has been very cooperative, so I'm really going to push that. They say, we have Eula Otis's recipe. So Claire was able to support her family with that. I mean, they made a lot of money. And even now, they'll sell 5,000 on a weekend, on a like Friday to Monday, and more on a long weekend. These are just the women. There are men that will be in another source, but then we jump to 1959 when a woman by the name of Veronica Jetty, she had always wanted to open a hot dog stand. And the story goes, I had wonderful long talks with her daughter. And she said, every night my mother would have another Michigan sauce, and she'd say, is this it? Finally one night, her father said, I've had it, this is the one we're going to use, and that's the end of it. And so that became the recipe for brownies. And brownies has been in business since 1959. It has a distinctly different taste. It's sweet, it's much more tomatoey. And that was actually very good for Ronnie, because her husband was killed in a car accident. So she had to become a businesswoman, and she very successfully raised her children and financially made them very comfortable and allowed them to have an education. So these are three businesswomen who were operating independently at a time when we don't think women were doing that kind of thing, although they were. So, some people don't know what a gold star mother is. You don't want to be one. You trust me. Anybody? No? Want to tell? You know what it is.
Your son dies in the military.
Right. So, this Gold Star Mothers is an outcrop of World War I. World War I was a very different war for the United States. It wasn't the first time that we had been in battle outside of our own land. But these boys were dying, and most of them were dying from the flu in 1918. And the War Department had said, at some point we will bring our boys home. And that may have been a mistake, because when the war ended, these families started to clamor, we want our boys back. I mean, hundreds of thousands of young men died. And of course, if they died in battle, they were just buried where they fell, and then they were at some point moved to another pod. Some of these men were moved 3 or 4 times until they finally were placed into an American military cemetery. So during the 20s, this group of women who are like, we want this, we expect to have our boys returned, were actually, they actually succeeded in doing that. And by the 1920s, every family got a letter, and you had 2 choices. You could leave your son buried in Belgium or France, or the boy could be repatriated. Now that meant digging that body up again. And some of these families thought, he will look just like he did when he left. I know. And so, because the mortuary business was saying, oh, this is what we have now, we can, embalm these people, blah, blah, blah. And so there are a group of many people actually repatriated the sons, and one of the men is from Ellenburg and Plattsburgh, and he actually went to New Jersey for the first shipment of 6,000 coffins, and he met the coffin. The coffin was brought back here. There was another wake. This is 4 years after he died, and he was reburied in 1922 with full military honors from the barracks. I know that. That is the importance of cemetery information. There's another group of women who said, not only, we want to see where our sons are, and it wasn't just sons, it could be your husband, okay, and if you were a widow. Now mind you, there are no Gold Star fathers, okay? And so the mothers succeed actually with the highest levels of government during the Depression to be allowed to go to Europe. And they for instance, the next page, two women, Minnie Mayo. Minnie is from Rouse's Point. I know nothing about this woman. In fact, when I communicated with the Rouse's Point historian, I never got a response back. So I don't know. That's not uncommon. And then the other one is a woman by the name of Abigail Kluge, and she lived in Plattsburgh. And I know, there's very little information I know about these women. But these are the two women from Clinton County who agreed, we are going to go to France, which was probably a very brave thing to do. I mean, A, you're confronting your demons, and B, people didn't go to France in 1933. And think about this, it's the height of the Depression, and yet the government finds money. So the Catholic Daughters in Rouse's Point and the American Legion team together, and they have this farewell, they have this sending off banquet, okay? Everybody was dressed in nautical outfits from France. There were favors it was a party. I mean, look at this kid died, and you're having a party, and they were what do you call it when they give things away? Favors, and it was just a festive thing. And then the day that she leaves, it was a night train from, probably had left Montreal, and she's actually met, she has a Pullman, there's a band playing, they send her off, and when she gets to New York, she is met by her own, a person who's going to stay with her for the entire trip, okay? They are wined and dined in New York, they stay at the very best hotels, and they sail first class to Europe. And they have tours of Paris, they have tours of the surrounding area, and then they are brought to the cemetery where they spend 3 days in contemplation. Unfortunately, these women left no record as to how they felt. Mrs. Kluge said, we had a good time. I mean, of course, what's not to like? So you have the pre-vacation, and then after the 2 weeks, they spent 2 weeks, so this is a month trip. They sail back to New York, and then they come back here. That is so what was fascinating about this is that the only thing these women have in common, what do you notice about them? Did anything pop out?
The hats.
Their hats.
Okay, they wear hats. They could have been a farmer's wife, a miner's wife. They could have been some very wealthy woman from Manhattan, and the entire scope of America was put together. But there's some people who are missing from that. There are no people of color. And so the black women, they had the opportunity too, but when they got to New York, they stayed at YWCA at Harlem. They went steerage. They had separate tours in France and were actually, fried chicken and okra, and watermelon brought up from Tunisia. And I'm thinking, oh my God, and there were many black women who said, I'm not doing this. This is an insult, an absolute insult. So, you won't see anybody. And the War Department says, well, we just think that different women want to be with their own kind. They haven't, so we have made some improvements as time has gone on. Okay. So there is a group of women who decided to go, but as I say, there were very few black women who went. Interestingly, both Minnie and Abigail's sons died from the influenza. They did not die in battle. There were, I think, 2/3 of the deaths in World War I were associated with the Spanish flu. Okay. You gotta wonder what these women were thinking. I mean, this is 15 years or 16 years after their sons or husbands died. So there's a lot of time for closure, there's a lot of time for healing, and the truth is, they were 16 years or 15 years beyond what had happened to them. Plus, there was also an attitude in the country, my son did a good thing. It's hard for us to imagine that, but there was a sense of pride that your son had died in World War I to save the country from the heathen Hun. And so there was that going on. There are cases where women have left diaries, but nothing locally. So if anybody knows anything about the Mayo family, because I had students with that last name, this is a while back, they would probably be related to Minnie. Minnie died in the 50s, as did Abigail. So they've been gone for a very long
We
time.
have a good friend who goes to the coffee shop regularly, who was a wife of a Mayo, and if there's a Minnie in her life, she would know about it.
Okay,
So
That's
I
your
will ask
homework,
her.
Alice.
I will ask her.
that's your homework.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sir.
So I became aware of other women after I finished writing the book, and one of them is a woman by the name of Geraldine Laundrie, with that spelling. She's from Rouse's Point. She died in 1982. The first time, I know very little about Geraldine, okay, because I'm very reliant on talking to family members for a lot of this stuff. But I can do some digging, deeper. She's not included in the book, but she's an interesting story. She's hired in 1929 to work at the border. I don't know how to say this, but there were women who were crossing that probably needed to be checked, and so they had women do it. And so that's what Geraldine did. She goes through World War II. She's living in D.C. doing war work. She comes back and she becomes the very first woman in the United States to be a customs officer. And so I think that's a pretty important thing. It's not Women's Hall of Fame stuff, not like Lucy Cobbs Taylor, but it's pretty significant because today a lot of women do that, but she was the first. So again, if anybody knows anything about Geraldine Laundrie, I would love to know that too. Anybody have any questions? I failed to ask that after each person. I can't answer many about Geraldine. The Michigans?
I would bet Donna Racine is related to Geraldine Laundrie.
She is.
And she has just recently died in last year.
Maybe she would.
But her daughter would
Okay.
know much, I think.
So Geraldine was not married, so that is her maiden name. Many of the women in this book were not married.
That's a big name in Rouse's Point.
For whatever reason.
Yes, she did.
had a liquor
She
store.
ID'd me when I was 27. Mrs. Laundrie that owned the liquor store.
Yeah.
I was a newcomer to town, so
Are you
when
sure
I
it
went to
wasn't
buy
her?
a bottle, she ID'd me, so I told Al that he had a child bride.
You should take that as a compliment.
I did.
Anyway, so thank you. I appreciate that. The women that I wrote about, they're just extraordinary. When you think about what women were up against 200 years ago, and even today, I hear stories that I shouldn't be hearing in the 21st century. I was talking to a woman recently who said that she has a son and daughter who are very similar in age. They were both in college, and they're only in their 20s now, so this gives you an idea. And they both got a credit card at the same time. The boy was given a $2,000 limit, no questions. The daughter was given $500. And she had a job and he didn't. Why is that? They challenged it. But I'm sure all of you have stories like that.
That's all.
And I'd like to think that it's better, but I think the patriarchy is so subtle now that a lot of men don't really get it, you know.
So
And
what
I
was
know
your,
you can all relate to some of that stuff.
so what was your impetus for writing the book? I mean, how did you get the idea and decide to put it all together?
Because at some point, I realized the women were a story unto themselves. The problem that I had was finding the women. Because the problem I'm having with the men is that there's too many of them, of men who left legacies. But it was a bit of a challenge to find 25 women. But I did, because people would say, well, have you heard of, or have you heard of that? Or I read something, or there was a side comment made with this. And it's like, oh, like Georgia Harkness. Georgia Harkness grew up in Harkness, New York. Georgia was a brilliant young woman. She died in 1974. She was in her 80s, to give you an idea. She, like every other woman, she became a teacher, but she was very involved with the Methodist. She was a lifelong Methodist, and she wanted to go into ministry, but of course, she was a woman. So she went to Boston University and she did a PhD under the same advisor who advised Martin Luther King. Well, long story short, Georgia becomes the most significant female theologian of the mid-20th century in the world. She was playing with the big boys. I mean, she was at the opening of the National Council of Churches. She was dealing with Karl Barth, and she said, women have a place at the table. The table of God is not just for men. And she was very persistent. She wrote like 40 books. In 1956, it was Georgia Harkness who, through her persistence and with other people helping her, and it had to be a lot of men, is the reason why women are ordained in the Methodist tradition. I'm going to tell you a brief story about Georgia. I didn't plan to talk about her, but her family was Quaker, and Daniel Harkness was the first Harkness who came. Daniel had a wife named Abigail, and Abigail went to a meeting one day with a red coat, and the people said, no, Abigail can't come in here with a red coat. And he said, well, then I'm not coming back. So this was long before Georgia. This was her great-grandfather. And so she wore that metaphorical red coat. And, well, she never wore a red coat. I mean, it became a metaphor for her that I am not going to submit myself to this patriarchy. She was the first woman in the United States to get a full professorship teaching theology in the United States. And it's at a theology school associated with Northwestern. When women graduate from that, they wear red shoes. I love that story, to honor her. I mean, there are still lectures in her name every year. So, anybody else, questions?
So you have some books for sale.
Yes, I do.
How do you get them? How do you get a book if you're not here?
You want me to, what do you want me to do?
Are they online, or how do you?
I'm going to have to get this back
website?
to you. The publisher is Bloated Toe, one word out of Peru.
From Champlain,
And
originally.
you could just go through Bloated Toe's webpage, but they're also in all the bookstores in Plattsburgh. I do not know how to put it on Amazon, and I've been told not to. So,
Okay, Larry Gooley, out of
Larry's
Bordentown.
astounding. Larry's a local boy from here.
Yeah.
Larry is an astounding historian. When he got hold of the Eula Oda story, he says, "There's more to this story, Dad." And so he sent me 3 pages of stuff that he'd researched. I'm like, oh my God, it's all dirt, you know. Not that I would publish dirt, but it's like, it makes for good telling, like right here. Like when she got married to Garth, I don't think Garth knew she'd been married before. She may not have been divorced, you know. So they finally got divorced, and she ended up.
They didn't have computers then.
No, they didn't. And she ended up she brought the Michigan to Lake George, and then she ended up in New York, where she became a nurse, and she moved to Florida and died in 1976. That's been amazing detective work, you know, which makes it fun. But I can see how some people would just like, I don't want to do this, you know, write fiction instead.
So where are all these women from? Are they just from the north?
They're all from Clinton County. They
All
all,
from Clinton
yes,
County.
and I just think that's pretty darn astounding. You know,
Okay.
we have, some of you might know Dr. Ruth Copeland. Ruth Copeland was, you would know her as an anesthesiologist. Her daughter, Nancy Hughes, taught in Northeastern. And Nancy and her sister, Barb Perry, were so helpful, so wonderfully helpful when I was writing it. But their mother was the first doctor. I think if you were to draw a line from, say, Albany to Syracuse, and, you know, up, she's probably within the top 3 of the first women coming north to be a doctor in 1943. And that's just a fascinating story. I mean, when she went to medical school, there were only 4 slots for women. And then when she finished, there were no internships because hospitals wouldn't take them. And, you know, so, I mean, the hurdles that these women jump through are just amazing.
Back to the hot dog story from Michigan. When she sold the hot dogs, Michigan style.
Dash, Michigan style.
Yeah, was it because the recipe is from Michigan, or?
Yes, what I have, again, thank God for ancestry and the power of the internet, is they were living in Flint, Michigan. And I can only assume that she was given a recipe there, because that's where they were living. Now, there's anecdotal comments like she got it from some man in Detroit, but there's no mention of that. They weren't living in Detroit, they were living in Flint. The guy who did the research on the Flint coney, now mind you, in Michigan, they're called conies, but here they're called Michigans, and you get the irony, is that this man has actually, because he's a Michigonian, and a Flint Michigonian, has been able to trace it to where it came from in Europe. And I'm not telling you anymore. But I will tell you that Eula Otis has always been given credit as being the first person, and she's not. There was another wave of it coming in about 10 years earlier, and there's another Michigan place of hospital that's going to be able to say we were the first. So, and that's all I'm going to say. Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you,
So
everyone.
anyway, I'll sit here if anybody's interested. So.
And for those who don't know how to spell Bloated Toe, there it is, Bloated Toe Enterprises Books. And they have a whole bunch to offer here that you can find on their website, including the one that we just saw here in this presentation.